Hi, I'm Keith McIntyre, for those who don't know me. I'm the coordinator of the Inform program along with Jerry. And today we have two presenters, Sandy Van Kalker and Deborah Gary Hook. And then we will be rounding off our Inform lecture series in June. That presentation will take place on June 21st, where we actually have four presenters, although working in groups, working tag team. And then we're going to take the summer off and pick back up in September, starting we'll have a September 20th presentation from Sander Wooten's lab in Mount Sinai, New York. And then the following month is the Inform Symposium, the end of October. So that'll give you, plenty of time to register. There is a minimal fee of $40 plus expenses or fees. And but anyway, we hope to see you all then in October at the Inform virtual conference. So without any more, I will turn it over to Jerry to introduce our first speaker and get started.
Okay, thanks. And for those of you who have been working on the Inform Planning Group, please be aware that in July we will have a meeting of that group. So be on the lookout for that invite. And if you are interested in participating a little bit more in planning these things, let me know and we'll be happy to add you to the group. This morning we're going to look at a little bit more of the nutritional side of our therapies related to fatty acid oxidation disorders. Both of our presenters are RDs, and in addition, you'll see that, or you'll hear that both are either have or are obtaining their PhDs in nutrition. Sandy Van Kalker is going first, and she's an associate professor in the Department of Molecular and Medical Genetics and affiliated with the graduate program in human nutrition at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. She's joining us from Madison, Wisconsin, where she was for many years the metabolic dietitian for the group there. As part of the interdisciplinary clinical team at OHSU Metabolic Genetics Clinic, Sandy specializes in nutritional management of inborn errors of metabolism, including fatty acid oxidation. She was chair of a committee that developed international nutrition guidelines for the treatment of VLCAD. Those were published last fall in the molecular in molecular and medical genetics. Sandy is a founding member and past president of the GMDI, the Genetic Metabolic Dietitians International. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sandy. Please dive in, and everybody else mute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Hold on one second. Okay, can people see this?
We got you.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Inform for inviting me. I will be talking about the nutrition management guideline and how it can apply for both professionals and families and consumers. So I will present highlights from the nutrition management guideline, talk a little bit about how the guidelines can be used in a clinical setting, and then introduce the toolkit which accompanies the guidelines. So this is the fourth in a series of nutrition management guidelines. This is a collaborative effort between Southeast Regional Genetics Network and GMDI. And the idea is to foster optimum nutrition management of individuals with inborn errors and reduce the uncertainty and variability in their management. And there we go. Okay, so we decided to focus on VLCAD for several reasons. Definitely, for those of you that have been in the field a long time, management has evolved especially with newborn screening. There's a wide range of presentations, and the guidelines do break things down based on severe, moderate, and mild phenotypes. There's limited literature, very few details about nutrition management in the published literature. Most will say we put our patient on low-fat diet with MCT without any further details than that. And there's definitely a lot of variability in practice. So just really briefly, the guideline process, we started with literature review. We did a Delphi. Delphi's included both MDs and RDs. Put this all together, wrote up preliminary recommendations. Then we had a nominal group. Jerry was very nice to join this. Again, it was MDs, RDs, researchers. We all got together, talked about the preliminary guidelines based on what remained a question or controversial from the nominal group. We did a second round of the Delphi. Based on all of this together, we wrote guidelines, and then we did a review process where we had people field test them for us. And this whole process, we had 95 people working on this at some point or another. So where do you find the guidelines? The website's listed there. You can find it under the guideline section. This is the web-based version of the guidelines. This is an outline of what's in the guidelines. The big things you probably would want to look at are the nutrition recommendations, which we'll talk about. And then there's also some valuable tables that can help people who are managing these patients. If you don't want to look through a website, you can look at the paper that Jerry mentioned that came out this fall in MGM. All in all, the recommendations include 30 recommendations based on 6 different questions. So I'd like to just briefly explain what's in these questions and maybe 2 recommendations for each one. The largest question was about nutrient intake, diet composition for the different categories of VLCAD. We also looked at breastfeeding, fasting, essential fatty acids, cornstarch. This is a table that outlines for healthy people what you would like the diet to look like. So this includes different age groups. Total fat is the same as for the general population, as is energy and protein recommendations. But then within the total fat, we have recommendations based on percent of total energy for both the long chain fat and medium chain fat. So again, I'm not going to spend much time with this other than to let you know it's in there, and it can be helpful when you're deciding how you want the diet composed for different patients. Okay. We do want to support breastfeeding for asymptomatic infants. We brought this up in the 2 Delphis and the nominal group. Consensus was that we can allow exclusive breastfeeding without MCT in mild patients. We can also keep them on regular infant formula. Moderate, we can allow breastfeeding. Might need to consider supplementing with medical food. And then those with severe VLCAD, the primary source should be a low long chain fat MCT supplemented medical food. Cornstarch was something we discussed. In many of the cases in the literature, cornstarch was used at night to allow for extended fasting. But the guideline is now I'm unmuted, I hope. Anyway, we're emphasizing a bedtime snack rather than using cornstarch. Some patients who might have poor tolerance of fasting, you might need to consider overnight enteral feeding, but that seems to be very few patients, and most do well with a complex carbohydrate snack. And why are we not moving forward here? There we go. There's also a question about illness. We talk about strategies to prevent decompensation and both management at home and during admissions. This was just one question we asked about what carbohydrate source we want to emphasize for at-home management. And really there wasn't a consensus that using glucose polymers were preferred over other simple carbohydrates such as juice. Although there was not consensus in for infants, the blue is the MDs. They felt that you could use any old glucose source versus the RDs who felt that glucose polymers should be emphasized during infancy. But older ages, there wasn't a difference. For question 3, we looked at supplementation, carnitine, trihaptenoin, bezafibrates. The paper includes recommendations for carnitine only because at that point, trihaptenoin was not approved. Our next step here is to expand the guidelines to include recommendations for use of trihaptenoin. So, as you know, carnitine is controversial. I won't go through all that, but we did suggest that supplementation is necessary only if free carnitine is less than 10 micromoles per liter, starting with a low dose. One thing we did not reach consensus on is whether to avoid cornstarch in acute illness. So that is an area that we need more evidence. We talked about monitoring. This is routine monitoring. This would be for all patients, all severities of VLCAD. The two that had consensus were to measure CK and plasma carnitine profiles. Conditional monitoring were those that would be helpful for some people. So for those on a low-fat diet, to monitor essential fatty acids and fat-soluble vitamins. If with a severe phenotype, to add cardiac measurements and labs. The one thing that did change was the use of acyl carnitine. So traditionally, acyl carnitines were used as a measure to assess nutrition management. We had a way where we just add up all the long chain acyl carnitines, and you had less than 2 micromoles per liter. That was good control. Higher than that, suggested adjustment. We are not using the adding up the acyl carnitines anymore, and recommending that it's not become a primary indicator of nutrition management. There's a lot of variability affected by fasting time, physical activity, etc. So we've kind of removed that as a primary marker. We also looked at exercise, activity recommendations, use of MCT pre-exercise. We want to encourage activity in those with VLCAD as tolerated, but many do not need limitations on activity. Routine physical activity can promote lean body mass, lower heart rate, improve muscle substrate oxidation. 20 minutes appears to be safe for all patients. Some may need to avoid longer bouts, but certainly we don't need to put exercise limitations on the entire group of patients with VLCAD. These are the recommendations for pre-exercise MCT. These are the doses that are recommended. We're suggesting it to be mixed in glucose solutions or Gatorade, apple juice. Need to watch this, especially when first starting out, because it can cause GI intolerance. The other thing was a concern is that if we're adding more MCT, we're adding extra calories. And the idea of just shifting around the MCT doses during a day to give it before activity rather than adding additional activity and additional calories. We looked at pregnancy. Very little out there, 4 published papers, 8 women, 12 cases. 2 of the 12 did have complications. One had hyperemesis gravidarum and myalgia in the first trimester and then improved as the pregnancy went on. The other started out without symptoms, but had increasingly severe rhabdomyolysis and starting at week 25. All of the pregnancies, except these 2, all of the others really did have improved symptoms during the pregnancy, but then saw a return of the muscle symptoms anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks after delivery. All the infants have been reported normal, but again, no, there aren't any papers out there that do a follow-up of these infants. Just based on time, I'm not going to go through the recommendations for pregnancy, other than to say we need to make sure that we're minimizing catabolism during labor and delivery, and we want to provide additional caloric support during that postpartum period, which may end up being as long as 8 weeks after delivery. I also wanted to bring up the VLCAD toolkit. This is associated with the guidelines, and this is more practical application of the guidelines. So you can find these in the same website. Just look under toolkits instead of guidelines. And what the toolkit does, again, is kind of a one-stop shop for materials that might be helpful for working with these patients. So it's based on case studies, which are listed here. The case studies go step by step, again, based on different scenarios that might be present with patients with VLCAD. So just some examples for an asymptomatic infant. I'm not going to go through these case studies other than to say, you know, everything is laid out, the labs are laid out, etc. These are a couple handouts that we developed. One is frequently asked questions. These are for consumers taking questions related to diet, providing a simple handout with answers. We also have a consumer summary of the guidelines in lay terms, what the guidelines are suggesting. We do include handouts from different companies. So we're not excluding anybody. These are just some general handouts or materials about VLCAD that you can give to your patients. We also have examples of emergency letters. We have tell people about the different organizations that are out there and how to get a hold of them. We've also developed sick day recipes for infants and older children. Handout again that can be given to parents. For a toddler, again, discussing transitioning from a medical formula to using MCT. These are the different MCT resources that are out there. Again, the toolkit will give you a description and also how to access these different resources. Another example would be an adult with rhabdomyolysis. This is a traditional case where somebody had VLCAD and then they just forgot they have VLCAD until we went on a hike, they weren't eating, they were drinking, and the next morning they ran into problems. So we're talking about the admission, but also what can be done afterwards to get this patient back on MCT, working with his diet. So we do have examples of protein sources as a handout. We have an optimizing exercise. So this is talking about both pre-exercise and post-exercise. This is adjustable based on the patient age, weight, etc., and gives examples. We also have a handout with some pre-activity snacks. Finally, we have various resources for the professional, such as the ACT sheets, gene reviews. There's a mentor nutrition training course put out by MetEd. We have access to that through the toolkit as well. And so in a nutshell, that's the guidelines and toolkit in 20 minutes. I do want to point out all the people that worked on this with the committee. PI is Ronnie Singh at Emory, Fran Rohr, and Mary Soa was our co-chair, but we had a lot of people work on one or the other or both of either the guideline or the toolkit. And with that, I will stop and see if there's any questions that I can answer.
Sandy, thanks for that. Thanks for that whirlwind tour.
Yeah,
such a lot of work. As I watched it evolve and ultimately come to publication, it's just impressive. And I always get frustrated when people say, well, we just don't know what to do. We have no evidence. We have evidence. It may not be double-blind placebo-controlled trials, but we have evidence. And this summarizes it very, very nicely. We have questions for Sandy. We have about 5 minutes. And I'll start off. The improvement in admittedly a small cohort of patients who are pregnant is unexpected. I understand in some diseases why we think it happens, but why do you think it happens in VLCAD deficiency? It seems like that would be a stress and make things worse.
Mm-hmm. I will admit also, I would not thought it would go that way. I honestly don't know, other than perhaps there's some hormonal effects or the anabolic, the anabolism associated with pregnancy. Perhaps that has some benefit to reduce mostly it's rhabdo and myalgia that these women are experiencing. All of these women would be classified as mild VLCAD. One would have gone into what I would consider the moderate category. But honestly, I'm not sure. And I don't know if anybody else has any ideas, but that definitely was a theme.
If you have questions for Sandy, you can enter them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and dive in. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep going, because even though I know the guideline, I still always have more questions every time I read it.
Sandy, very nice presentation.
Thank you.
You presented some data about pregnancies. Any tip that you can give about women who become pregnant? Because I have quite a few that are reaching that age.
Well, I would definitely, again, I didn't really go through these recommendations, but let's see if I can find it real fast. I think definitely we want to emphasize to these women that you need to know, let us know that you are considering pregnancy so that we can quote unquote tune them up before they become pregnant. Having a plan associated with a high risk OB clinic, I think would be important,
On our website.
including an ER protocol. We talked about whether diet needed to be changed. I think the consensus was to encourage diet adherence, but to really concentrate on sufficient calories. If the woman is not used to MCT, that may or may not work during pregnancy if you consider the first trimester, but to really make sure that the patient isn't losing weight, aggressively treating illnesses. I mean, in all of these inborn errors, other than PKU for sure, but the catabolism that's associated with labor and delivery and the postpartum period, to really watch them during that time using IV dextrose during the procedure. And then I think sending them home with the idea that you can't slack off, you need to be taking enough calories so that you're not becoming catabolic. Breastfeeding would not be contraindicated, but that would mean that the mother would really need to pay more attention to how much she was eating, again, to prevent the catabolism that could be associated with the energy needed for milk production. So I think all of this together, but I think the big thing is to just let the patients know that you need to work with us and to not just hide out at home.
Thank you.
Sandy, have you seen much impact of COVID on your patient population? It's been remarkably quiet here, though I've had some long distance interactions with folks.
We really haven't. I mean, we definitely, have sent information about COVID, the vaccines. Mostly we've been following the CDC recommendations and suggesting our patients do the same. So I'm not, as far as I know, I don't think any of our patients with any disorder really came down with COVID. If they did, it didn't seem to exacerbate the symptoms associated with whatever disorder they happen to have. So I would say we were pretty quiet during the whole thing too.
And of course, there wasn't any influenza around because everybody was wearing masks. So.
Right. There was, I mean, you have to look at the silver lining here. No, nobody did get the flu.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll go ahead and switch. And before I forget to say it at the end of the presentations, we are recording, and we'll have these up on the Inform website by probably the end of the week. So if you know anybody who wasn't able to attend, and I note that we have 59 people online right now, which is quite good. The presentations will be available. So we're going to shift now, and I'm pleased to introduce Deb Hook, who I've known for many years, and is going to do the next presentation. She's been a clinical dietitian for, she says, 30 years, most of those 27 working on IEMs. Spread over several children's hospitals, and most recently Children's LA Children's. She returned. I'll say it's relatively recently. It might feel like a long time, Deb, to UC Davis to get her a PhD, and is in the graduate group of nutritional biology. Her clinical research is on the nutritional needs of IEMs, as well as how diet is measured in clinical research. She has two master's degrees, one from Loma Linda University, I guess both from Loma Linda University, one in nutrition and the other in health education and promotion. and thus her excellent presentations when I've heard her speak. Now, here I didn't know this either. Deb says she speaks 3 languages, English, German, and French, and has lived in Europe and feels passionate about collaborative work and international. We all like to work with our international colleagues. She also enjoys running half marathons. Bad on your body, Deb. Long distance bicycle tours. And she's, as rest of us, waiting to get those borders open and start traveling again. So Deb, I don't have the title of your talk in front of me, so I'll let you introduce it yourself.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for inviting me to speak. So the title of my talk is Triheptanoin, Stability in Foods, Formula, and Emulsions. And this was work that we had done on 2 separate occasions, looking at stability of triheptanoin in foods, and then especially looking at its behavior in medical foods. Okay, so my disclosure is I consult with Ultragenyx. And when Bridget, Drs. Fikes, Heim, and Marsden, they're employed by Ultragenyx. Dr. Gillingham has received research grants from Ultragenyx. She also serves on our advisory board, and Angela as well serves on the advisory board. So look at the introduction, triheptanoin, or what's called Dojolvi. It's an oral liquid formulation. It's the first approved treatment. It's approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration. It's approved as a source of calories and fatty acids, and its population is both pediatric and adult with molecularly confirmed long-chain FAOD. Triheptanoin is odd carbon. Some people know it as C7. It belongs to the medium-chain triglyceride group. It consists of a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached to it, so 3 C7s attached to that glycerol backbone. And what makes triheptanoin unique and why we're using it in this population is it can be metabolized, and you can watch it in the schematic. And if you look at the schematic down in the bottom, what kind of pops up is the TCA cycle. And triheptanoin is metabolized to provide propionyl CoA, it's a 3-carbon entity, as well as acetyl CoA, which is a 2-carbon entity. But propionyl CoA becomes succinyl CoA, and that enters our TCA cycle and then promotes gluconeogenesis. So triheptanoin is administered intrally and orally, not by IV. You mix it. It's made to mix in beverages, standard foods, medical foods. That can be both formulas as well as nutrient modulars. And the reason why we mix it is we want to promote emulsification of the fat within the food, and this decreases the risk of gastrointestinal side effects. And the foods that we're looking at are foods that are typical in the diet of someone with long-chain fatty acid oxidation defect. So our objective was to look at the chemical and physical stability of triheptanoin when we combined it with these foods that were commonly consumed by this patient population. So our methods, we looked at, we studied low pH versus neutral pH. So our low pH is applesauce versus not something like non-fat milk. We looked at baking temperatures, so we utilized a muffin recipe, and then mechanical mixing, because that's what our patients would be doing with their formula. They would be doing not heat, not cold, but they would be mechanically mixing with triheptanoin. So our samples, we took triheptanoin, we did an internal standard, and that's decanol. And then with our control, we also used an internal standard. We mixed it, both the internal standard as well as triheptanoin with our non-fat milk, our applesauce, used it in a recipe, which we made muffins, and then as well as looking at medical formulas and nutritional modulars. Those are those single nutrient modulars. So sample preparation procedures. This was done in a lab, and so it was done under, just like you would, I always think of undergrad chemistry. I loved it, but you still have flashbacks, where there was a protocol and everything was handled in the same in the same way. So both the non-fat milk with the Tri-Hep as well as the non-fat milk with the control, which was control, were treated exactly the same. So you'll see over in the left-hand corner, the non-fat milk. We took a measured amount of non-fat milk. We added a measured amount of triheptanoin. This was weighed. We added an undecanol. That's our internal standard. We blended it for a minute, and then we put it into 8 bottles. The reason why we put it into 8 bottles is we had 8 different various conditions that we were running and looking at whether or not the triheptanoin degraded in the process. We did the same thing with our control, which is the non-fat milk with the internal standard. You move over towards the right, we did applesauce with a given amount of applesauce, a set amount of triheptanoin, internal standard. Again, we mimicked this in our control, which is the applesauce with only the internal standard. We did muffins. I laugh every time I see this recipe because they even very gently soaked the oats in buttermilk for 15 minutes. So everything again was laid out and done specifically. Same way with that which had our analyte, which is the triheptanoin, versus that which was done with the control. And the muffins were baked at 200 degrees Celsius. That's almost 400 Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. The emulsion was something that would typically be given to someone with a long-chain fatty acid defect. And we used a micellar casing. That's the protein module. We mixed that with triheptanoin, the internal standard, some flaxseed oil, because you're mixing, you need essential fatty acids. So that was put into the recipe. And then Solcarb, that was our carbohydrate module. Water was added. And then we blended this in a blender for 1 minute and then put this into several bottles and then started holding it at various temperatures. Did the same thing with the control. You might ask, many of the dietitians have asked, why do we have an internal standard? And an internal standard is used when we're going to look at it for gas chromatography, is we understand how the undecanol is going to behave, and we understand its peak. And so it's one way of having a standard that we'll compare our analyte against. And so you're making sure that you know what you're measuring and that things are going exactly as you planned. And what we'll see this in the end of how we looked at whether or not the triheptanoin degraded during the process. So our assay schedule for triheptanoin, if you'll look over to the left, we have our samples, our non-fat milk, our applesauce, our muffins, our formula. We have the various conditions that they were under, 25 degrees Celsius, and I think in Fahrenheit. So this is basically about 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so room temperature. 40 degrees Celsius. This is like a hot day in Palm Springs or in Arizona. So this is about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So a very, very warm room or very warm temperature. But both of them had humidity. So this was not like the desert. So it had 75% room humidity. And then we tested it from between 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, which is 36 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's your temperature of your refrigerator. So when we go back and we look at the non-fat milk and the applesauce, we're going to hold it at 25 degrees Celsius for 4 hours. We're going to hold it at the 40 degrees Celsius for 4 hours. And then when we think of refrigeration, because, that's what we would normally do with these foods, is we held it at 4 hours, 8 hours, 24 and 48. So up to about 2 days, which is usually the recommendation we would say if you mixed a food with something else, such as triheptanoin, that you need to throw it out, especially after 48 hours. When we look at the muffins, we're going to handle this a little bit differently. So we held them at what I consider room temperature, 25 degrees Celsius. We held them at 8, 24 hours, 3 days, 7 days. And then we looked at them under the conditions that I would say are refrigeration, 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. Again, 8, 24 hours, 3 days, and 7 days. When we looked at the formula, we had this at conditions that we would have with the non-fat milk and the applesauce. So we were looking at it at 25 degrees Celsius, again, our room temperature for 4 hours. And in a very hot situation, 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, and we held it for 4 hours. And then under conditions that we are mimicking refrigeration for 4, 8, 24, and 48 hours. We took the samples after their holding time, and we used a process called a product release method. And that's where you take a sample of the let's say the bottle, the formula, the milk that's in the bottle. You're going to use diethyl ether. You're also going to use sodium sulfate. You're going to filter this and use a separation funnel. And we extract out the triheptanoin, and we measure using gas chromatography of how much of the triheptanoin was still in the product. So the stability among the different food samples. So we saw no appreciable difference in triheptanoin degradation, whether it was mixed with beverages or foods, whether it was mixed and stored up to 4 hours at our room temperature, and then our extremely warm room, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think this is important. You might say, well, why test in this? And for those of us who live in California or the West or the Southwest, these are the temperatures that many of the homes are at, that our patients have that have no air conditioning. So it's important that we know what is the stability of triheptanoin at these temperatures. And then we looked at those things that were mixed and stored for 48 hours under what I would call refrigeration, and then those the triheptanoin that was baked in the muffin at about 200 degrees Celsius and then stored up for 7 days. So we saw no appreciable or significant triheptanoin degradation. So this is this busy table, and we were looking at the stability at different times among each sample. The standard is our comparator. And then you look over to the left, the non-fat milk. You have the start, you have 4 hours at room temperature. You moved it a little bit down farther in the column, and you have 4 hours at a very hot 104 degrees temperature, and then under refrigeration conditions at 4 hours, 8 hours, 24, and 48. And the percent of triheptanoin, people have questions under this, like how can you have 106% triheptanoin? You didn't gain triheptanoin when you were baking the muffin, or the refrigerator didn't inject triheptanoin into that sample. And what it is, it's the slight variation when you're doing gas chromatography that can be considered noise or slight contamination, but differences in the readout, but triheptanoin was not added. And so what this is telling us is it's very close, around 100%. And so we know that it's behaving how we think it's behaving, and that the triheptanoin did not degrade, that we had the amount of triheptanoin that we started with. So assessment of triheptanoin mixed with metabolic medical foods. So we were looking at triheptanoin. What would it degrade? How would it be incorporated when we worked with a recipe and then let it sit for a while? Did it separate it out? Could we swirl? Could we reincorporate it? And we took 3 recipes we developed, and they were they're what you would do for a patient with long-chain FAOD. And we used Basic F, which is a Malupa formula without fat. We use 5NX10, which is a elemental formula, which does not have fat. You add it to it if that's what you want. And then we did a modular. Our recipe 3 is a modular recipe. All of them were mixed with walnut oil, which we would use, let's say, to provide essential fatty acids. That's refined walnut oil. It's pure walnut oil. It's not a mixture with, let's say, olive oil or something else. We added our measured amount triheptanoin. We added water. And for recipe 2 and 3, we needed to add a carbohydrate source. For 5NX10, we still needed to add extra carbohydrate. And so we used Polycal, which is a maltodextrin. And in recipe 3, Provimin is our protein source. So the Polycal is our carbohydrate source. And then, of course, our fat comes from triheptanoin and walnut oil. we did two things. We mixed it with a blender, and then we mixed it by shaking, thinking of what was the, kind of simulating what a patient would do, let's say when they mixed it, maybe on the road or at school or away from the home, and they would mix all the ingredients into a baby bottle and shake it. The other thing we did is we mixed triaptanoin with Polycal and Pedialyte. And this is because many times when a patient is sick and you want to give fat-free calories, you're mixing, you're giving them Pedialyte, but you're also adding a little bit more carbohydrate to it to make it a little bit more calorically dense. So, and this we did again by blending and shaking. The mixtures were observed at time 0, after 1 hour at room temperature, and then after 4 hours of refrigeration. So kind of an assessment, Polycal and Pedialyte. So when we mix those together, they lacked emulsifiers. So the triaptanoin, it makes sense, separated out very easily. But if you did a 3-second swirl, just a swirl, you could reincorporate it with it. When we looked at Milupa, which is our basic F, that's a carbohydrate protein formula powder, which lacks fat. And when we look, and so we added the fat, Vivanex 10, again, that's our elemental amino acid formula. When we use the blender or shaken, of course, because it has emulsifiers in it, it mixed very well. And I have pictures in the next slide. Provimen, when we blended it, when we were using the blender, Provimen incorporated with the triaptanoin. When we put the Provimen, the Polycal, the walnut oil, and the triaptanoin into a bottle and then shook it, that did not incorporate the triaptanoin. So again, as what you'll see with the slide, next one, is you see the Milupa Basic F, that's over on our left. In the middle is our Vivanex 10. Over to the right is our Provimen mixture. And BL stands for baseline. So you can see we mixed it. We either blended it with the mixer. That's over on the left. That's the pictures on the left. On the right are those shaken. But you can see when you look at the Milupa and the Vivanex pictures that it blended quite well. When you look over to the Provimen, when we used a blender, it blended very, very well. It looks like an acceptable product. But when we shook it, again, we couldn't get that triaptanoin to incorporate. Now, if we look at kind of the middle part of the slide, where we're holding things at 4 hours at, let's say, at refrigeration, what you'll see for the Milupa Basic F is the triaptanoin kind of starts to float to the surface, which is what you expect of a fat to do. But when you swirl it, which is the pictures just down below it, you can see it incorporates. And incorporates whether you start with the mixture that was blended using a blender or whether you started with the mixture that was shaken. Now the Vivanex, again, that's in the center of the center. When we look at holding it at room temperature for 1 hour, you can see that the triaptanoin starts to float to the top, whether it was blended in a blender or whether it was shaken. But again, just swirling it gentle. And this is not hard mechanical swirling. This is just gentle swirling. But you can see that once you do that, the triaptanoin incorporates. Now, if we move over to the right with the Provimen, what you'll see is, and you follow the blended, after 4 hours, the triaptanoin starts to float to the top. And then when we swirl it a little bit, it incorporates. And what you'll notice is the products look palatable. They look like metabolic formulas that these patients are used to using, something that I would consider very acceptable. So our conclusions were the study demonstrated physical and chemical stability of the triaptanoin in different beverages and foods which are typical for this patient population, as well as when we baked it in muffins. It could be easily mixed in several available metabolic medical foods. So we used very realistic recipes that this patient population would be using. And the findings inform basic dietitians, patients, caregivers about how to administer triamcinolone in these medical foods, what they'll look like, and that they're acceptable products. And I'd like to acknowledge Alex Huben and Patrick Anderson of Ultragenyx, who oversaw the food stability studies and provided the analytical methods and data. Beth Scott, who provided the medical writing, and Alison Savano, who provided the graphics, which were used. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Deb. That was great, incredibly practical and useful. Does anybody have specific questions for Deb? If not, I always do. Let me start with I guess it's an easy one. Did you compare this stuff after everybody ate them? Did you look to see if there were any differences in C3 levels, C3 carnitine levels in folks after, or C5 after they ate any or drank any of these preparations?
So what you're asking is, did we do the test and then feed these to people and then look at? No. These were food stability tests. Yeah. So kind of, it's where we were navigating the realms of food science and what did the triheptanoate degrade in these products. They're really common questions from dietitians of how can we mix it? Is it stable? And I think the pictures are really nice because you can see that, as you know, Dr. Buckley, that looks like the formula that we have all our patients take. And so although, wouldn't be on a menu of a five-star restaurant, it still is a very acceptable product and what they're used to.
Mm-hmm. And how about other formulations of triheptanoate, solid, a MCT ProCal equivalent? That's the question that I get a lot from folks.
Did we compare it to, let's say, where, let me think. So we were using, let's say, the non-fat milk, and we would have non-fat milk mixed with trihep, non-fat milk, with just our internal standard, and then let's say non-fat milk, using it against head-to-head with MCT ProCal. Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm actually asking if Ultragenyx is going to make anything other than the oil form.
Oh, I see. Oh gosh, yeah, I was still thinking.
Going to put you on the spot.
I know that there are ideas that the company has, and the company is very willing to listen to the needs of the community, and they're very open to the needs of the community. And I know that the community has voiced, different ways that they want things, so that they can, so that it's easy to transport and things like that. Yes.
All right. There are some questions in the chat. Have you tried frying foods with C7?
So far, we haven't. And I know that's something that people want. The problem with frying is you get into temperatures when you recommend it, and this is really a drug, and which is different than, let's say, me as a dietitian telling someone to fry something in a canola oil or an olive oil. This is definitely a drug, and you want a measured amount, and for some patients it's not that much. And when you start frying, it coats the pan, and it's not going into the patient. But the other thing is that when you start encouraging that, you don't go home with the patient, and so you don't have control of how hot it is. So I may, as someone who had a food science class, know exactly what a smoke point is and how to set temperatures of my frying pan, but you're not going to have that in a home. So, and then the big thing I think is that it coats the pan. The pan eats it, but you don't. Yeah.
And then another question, do you think this is really equivalent to MCT oil in performance? Does MCT oil behave the same in stability and emulsification?
I can't speak. speak to that. And I know that, like so much that dietitians do, we do it because it's been handed down and we've done it. And you have this like folklore or this belief that it's safe. And people do many things with MCT oil. They make MCT butter. You can buy that commercially in Europe. There's some lovely products in Europe that I wish were in the US. And there's cookbooks for using it. I have never seen anyone do the type of testing, the rigorous testing that we've done on triamcinolone on an MCT product. And there again, you would have to select more than one, and then you'd have to make sure that you check for purity. Because many, as you know, Dr. Foxley, many of the clinical MCT products on the market are not pure MCT. They have other fatty acids in them.
And Melanie Gillingham says the muffins are particularly helpful, and I'll vouch for her C7 brownies and oatmeal cookies. They're pretty good too.
Yeah. I know when we talked to I was the original dietitian that kind of created some of the recipes for that initial testing, and there were several. Like my wish list was really long, and the scientists were like, "No, we're cutting it here. This is what we're testing," and so I think this is a beginning. It's a beginning conversation, and we can look at many other things, many other recipes.
Well, thank you very much, and we're almost to the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and call it quits here. I thank both of our speakers today. Really, moving into a new era here in treatment of long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders. Triheptanone is of course the first approved medication in the U.S. I'm not sure if it's there yet in Europe. It is approved in Canada now, so it's becoming more widely available. Those of us who use it in the clinical trials have gotten quite comfortable with it, and I don't see any difference between it and MCT oil. So it hopefully we'll all be able to access it for your patients as you see fit in the coming months and years. So with that, we'll turn the Zoom meeting off and remind you that it's available at the end of the week, likely on the website, if you want to pass it on to your friends and colleagues. Thanks again to Deb and Sandy for presenting, and we'll see you next month for our final one in the season of the series. Bye all.
Thank you.